At c. 4:30 hours on July 23, 1942, Lieutenant Alan Hattie squinted through morning mist at the Kumusi River crossing near Wairopi. His 12-man platoon from B Company, 39th Battalion, had demolished the footbridge the previous day. Now, across 60 meters of fast-moving water, Japanese troops were assembling, more than he could count. They wore jungle green uniforms and carried Type 38 rifles. They were forming into assault columns. Hattie had 77 men defending Kokoda village, 4 kilometers to the south. The Japanese force across the river numbered at least 1,500. He gave the order to withdraw. The decision made tactical sense. A platoon could not stop a regiment, but it marked the beginning of a retreat that would last 67 days, cover 96 kilometers of mountain jungle, and cost 625 Australian lives. The men who would fight this retreat were 18 and 19 years old. They had completed 1 month of basic training. They carried weapons left over from the First World War. They faced veteran Japanese troops who had conquered Singapore, Malaya, and the Philippines in less than 6 months. Port Moresby, the capital of Papua, sits on the southern coast of New Guinea, 140 kilometers south of Kokoda. In July 1942, it represented the last Allied base north of Australia. Loss of Port Moresby would give Japan airfields capable of striking Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. Japanese bombers based in Rabaul could already reach Darwin. Port Moresby would extend that range by 800 kilometers. The Japanese understood this strategic reality. In May 1942, they had attempted to capture Port Moresby by amphibious assault. The Battle of the Coral Sea stopped them. The invasion fleet turned back after losing the carrier Shoho and suffering heavy damage to Shokaku. The sea route was closed. The overland route remained between Port Moresby and the northern coast. The Owen Stanley Range rises to 2,490 meters. Mount Bellamy, the highest point along the crossing route, reaches 2,190 meters. The mountain chain extends 376 kilometers from Mount Chapman in the west to Mount Victoria in the east. Sir Kingsley Norris, who served as senior medical officer for the Australian 7th Division, described the terrain as 96 kilometers of ridges rising and falling through jungle so thick that visibility at ground level rarely exceeded 10 meters. The Kokoda Track cut through this barrier. It was not a road. It was not a trail in any conventional sense. It was a single-file footpath, barely 1 meter wide in most places. Following native pathways between villages, the track started at Ower's Corner, 50 kilometers northeast of Port Moresby at 600 meters elevation. It climbed to 1,200 meters at Yoribaiwa Ridge, descended to 300 meters at the Eora Creek Crossing, climbed again to 1,700 meters at Templeton Crossing, then descended to 1,100 meters at Diisarava, before climbing a final time toward Kokoda at 373 meters elevation. A fit walker could cover the distance in 7 days. Soldiers carrying 30-kilogram packs, ammunition, weapons, and rations required 10 to 12 days in good weather. Rain turned the track into mud that reached knee depth. Stream crossings became impassable when water levels rose. Sleep deprivation, inadequate food, and tropical disease reduced forward progress to 1 kilometer per hour on the steepest sections. The Japanese had identified the track as a potential invasion route in 1940, when their intelligence services prepared assessments of Allied positions in the Southwest Pacific. Pre-war reconnaissance suggested that a motor road might connect Kokoda to the north coast. This proved incorrect. The track was passable only on foot, but it remained the only route across the Owen Stanley Range that did not require mountain climbing equipment. On July 21, 1942, elements of the South Seas Detachment began landing at Gona and Buna on the northern coast. Major General Tomitaro Hori commanded the force, which consisted primarily of the 144th Infantry Regiment and the 41st Infantry Regiment. Total strength approached 6,000 men. These were not garrison troops. The 144th had fought in the Malaya campaign. They were experienced in jungle warfare, night attacks, and rapid infiltration. Each soldier carried 16 days of rations and orders to reach Port Moresby within 30 days. The advance guard, commanded by Colonel Yokoyama Yosuke of the 15th Independent Engineer Regiment, moved out on July 22nd. They had trucks and bicycles for the flat coastal terrain. By evening of July 23rd, they had covered 20 kilometers and reached the Kumusi River at Wairopi. Across the river, They encountered Hattie's platoon. The Australians defending the track belonged to the 39th Battalion, a militia unit raised in Victoria in October 1941. The battalion consisted of 1,068 men, mostly conscripts called up under the National Service Act. Average age was 18.5 years. Training had occurred at Darley Camp near Bacchus Marsh for 52 days before the battalion deployed to Port Moresby aboard the Aquitania on December 26, 1941. They had arrived in Papua on January 3, 1942. For 5 months, they performed garrison duties at 7 Mile Aerodrome, building defensive positions, unloading supply ships, and conducting local patrols. On July 7th, B Company received orders to march to Kokoda and establish a garrison at the airfield there. They reached Kokoda on July 15th. 120 men, 1 platoon forward at Wairopa. The rest at Kokoda village. No radio, no artillery support. Instructions to hold the airfield until reinforcements arrived. The Papuan Infantry Battalion accompanied them. This was a locally recruited force of 310 men, including 30 European officers and NCOs. Major William Watson commanded. The PIB's role was reconnaissance. They operated as scouts, guides, and light infantry. They knew the terrain. They spoke the languages. They understood jungle fighting in ways the Australians did not. At Wairopa, on July 23rd, the two forces faced each other across the Kumusi River. Hattie's platoon held the southern bank. The Japanese held the north. The bridge was destroyed. The river was too deep and fast to ford without support. The Japanese began constructing a temporary crossing. Hattie withdrew toward Kokoda before they completed it. The Japanese crossed the Kumusi on July 24th and advanced along the track. PIB patrols engaged them at Garari, 6 kilometers north of Kokoda, in a brief firefight that killed 4 Japanese and 2 Papuans. The main Japanese force bypassed the ambush and continued south. By evening of July 28th, they had reached positions overlooking Kokoda from the north. Kokoda village occupied a plateau at the base of the Owen Stanleys. The airfield lay to the west, a cleared strip 800 meters long and 60 meters wide. The village itself consisted of approximately 20 native houses, a government station, and a mission. The Australian position centered on the airfield. B Company held defensive positions along the northern and western perimeters. The PIB covered the eastern approaches. Lieutenant Colonel William Owen commanded the Australian force. He had arrived from Port Moresby on July 26 with additional personnel from the 39th Battalion, bringing total strength to approximately 300. Owen was a 2nd AIF officer, transferred to the militia to provide combat experience to the younger troops. He had fought in Syria. He understood defensive warfare. He also understood that 300 men could not hold Kokoda against 6,000. The Japanese attacked at 0400 hours on July 29. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, a tactic designed to prevent concentrated defense. Mortar fire hit the airfield. Machine gun fire raked the defensive positions. Japanese infantry moved through the darkness toward the Australian lines. Owen moved forward to direct the defense. He positioned himself with the forward platoon on the northern perimeter. At approximately 30 hours, a Japanese machine gunner opened fire from 50 meters. Owen was hit multiple times and died within minutes. Command devolved to Captain Samuel Templeton. The battle continued through dawn. The Australians held their positions until approximately 0700 hours, when Japanese troops began infiltrating around the eastern flank. Templeton ordered withdrawal. The Australians pulled back through the village toward Daniki, 4 kilometers south, where the track entered the mountains. Private Bruce Parr remained behind with a Bren gun. He waited until a group of approximately 24 Japanese gathered in the village center, celebrating their victory. At 60 meters range, he emptied a 30-round magazine into them. 20 died. Parr withdrew through the rubber plantation and caught up with the main force. Australian casualties at Kokoda totaled 7 killed and 6 wounded. Japanese casualties exceeded 95. But Kokoda was lost. The airfield was lost. The only forward base between Port Moresby and the north coast was now in Japanese hands. The strategic implications were immediate. Without Kokoda, Australian forces could not be reinforced or resupplied by air. Everything would have to be carried up the track on foot. Medical evacuation would require carrying wounded soldiers over 96 kilometers of mountain jungle. The Japanese, conversely, could fly supplies and reinforcements into Kokoda and advance toward Port Moresby with a secure rear base. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander Southwest Pacific Area, received news of Kokoda's fall on July 30th. His headquarters was in Brisbane, 2,500 kilometers from the fighting. He had no personal knowledge of New Guinea terrain. His staff maps showed a road connecting Kokoda to Port Moresby. Intelligence reports describing the track as impassable did not reach him or were discounted. He ordered Major General Basil Morris, commanding New Guinea Force, to retake Kokoda immediately. Morris understood the reality. The 39th Battalion was already withdrawing under pressure. The Japanese outnumbered Australian forces 20-1. Retaking Kokoda would require reinforcements, artillery, air support, and time to prepare. None were immediately available. The Australian Imperial Force divisions were fighting in North Africa. The American divisions were deploying to Guadalcanal. The only forces available in Papua were militia battalions with minimal training and obsolete equipment. Morris explained this to MacArthur's headquarters. The response was unequivocal. Retake Kokoda. Hold the track. Prevent the Japanese from reaching Port Moresby. The orders allowed no flexibility regarding how this would be accomplished or with what forces. On August 8th, the 39th Battalion attempted to retake Kokoda. Major Alan Cameron commanded approximately 430 men. They advanced from Deniki at dawn, moving through dense jungle along the track. The Japanese had reinforced their garrison. Approximately 660 men from the 1st Battalion, 144th Infantry Regiment, now held Kokoda. They were dug in. They had machine guns positioned to cover all approaches. They expected the attack. The Australians made contact at Piok, 2 kilometers north of Kokoda. At approximately 1100 hours, the fighting was close range. Visibility was limited to 10 meters. Individual soldiers fought without seeing their platoon commanders. Fire discipline broke down as men shot at movement and sound. The Australians pushed forward through the afternoon, gaining ground through sheer aggression. By 1600 hours, they had reached the outskirts of Kokoda. The Japanese counterattacked at 1700 hours. Fresh troops from the reserve moved around the Australian flanks. Machine gun fire came from 3 directions. Cameron ordered withdrawal before his force was encircled. The Australians pulled back to Deniki, losing the ground they had gained. The attack had cost approximately 20 Australian casualties. It accomplished nothing strategically but delayed the Japanese advance by 4 days. Those 4 days proved critical. The Japanese had expected weak resistance. They had estimated Australian strength at Kokoda at 1,000 to 1,200 men based on the ferocity of the attack. This intelligence error caused them to pause and wait for additional reinforcements. Meanwhile, Australian intelligence intercepted Japanese communications referring to operations on Guadalcanal. The Japanese 17th Army was divided between 2 campaigns. Resources were finite. Port Moresby would have to wait, but the advance continued. On August 16th, Japanese forces moved south from Kokoda toward Isarava, 14 kilometers along the track. The terrain between Kokoda and Isarava favored defense. The track climbed through steep ravines and crossed multiple streams. Defensive positions at Isarava commanded the approaches. The 39th Battalion had been reinforced by the 53rd Battalion, another militia unit. Brigadier Selwyn Porter commanded 30th Brigade headquarters. Now positioned at Isarava, total Australian strength approached 1,000 men. More importantly, the 21st Brigade of the Australian 7th Division had arrived from Australia. These were AIF soldiers, veterans of the Syria campaign. The 2nd 14th Battalion and 2nd 16th Battalion reached Isarava on August 23rd, bringing strength to approximately 1,500. Brigadier Arnold Potts commanded. He was a competent commander who understood defensive warfare and how to use terrain. The Japanese attacked at dawn on August 26th. Approximately 6,000 men from both regiments of the South Seas Detachment advanced along the track and through the jungle on both flanks. They used infiltration tactics, sending small groups through gaps in the Australian lines to attack from behind. They attacked at night, when Australian soldiers could not identify targets beyond 10 meters. They used bugle calls and whistle signals to coordinate movements, creating the impression of larger forces than actually existed. The Battle of Isarava lasted 4 days. The Australians held positions along ridges overlooking the track. The Japanese attacked repeatedly, taking heavy casualties but gaining ground through numerical superiority. Private Bruce Kingsbury of the 2nd 14th Battalion earned a posthumous Victoria Cross on August 29th when he counterattacked with a Bren gun, killing approximately 20 Japanese before being shot. His action temporarily stabilized the Australian line. By August 30th, the position was untenable. Potts ordered withdrawal to Eora Creek. The pattern repeated at Eora Creek on August 31st, at Templeton Crossing on September 2nd, at Afoji on September 5th, at Brigade Hill on September 8th, at Yoribaiwa on September 14th. Each position was defended. Each position was eventually abandoned. The Australians withdrew step by step toward Port Moresby, fighting rearguard actions that inflicted casualties but could not stop the Japanese advance. The 39th Battalion was exhausted. On September 5th, when they were finally relieved at Afoji, strength had fallen to 185 men from an original 1,500. The rest were casualties or evacuated sick. Malaria had infected approximately 80% of the battalion. Dysentery was epidemic. Tropical ulcers developed on any cut or scratch that became infected. Men who could still walk were considered fit for duty regardless of fever or diarrhea. The track itself became an enemy. Rain fell continuously from mid-August through September. The track turned to mud. Soldiers sank to their knees with each step. Stream crossings required wading through chest-deep water. Bridges were logs placed across gaps, slippery with moss and rain. A fall meant injury. An injury meant evacuation. Evacuation meant 4 native carriers would spend 2 days carrying 1 soldier back to Port Moresby instead of carrying ammunition forward. Supply was the limiting factor. Every round of ammunition, every ration pack, every piece of equipment had to be carried from Port Moresby to the front line. The distance was 96 kilometers. The terrain was impassable for pack animals. Everything moved on the backs of Papuan carriers who worked for minimal pay under conditions that killed approximately 1 in 10. The carriers were recruited by the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit, which had authority to conscript native labor under emergency regulations. Pay was 4 shillings per week. Rations were rice, tinned meat, and whatever could be foraged locally. Working conditions consisted of carrying 30-kilogram loads over mountain tracks in continuous rain while being strafed by Japanese aircraft and shelled by Japanese mortars. The carriers died from exhaustion, disease, malnutrition, and enemy action. No accurate casualty figures exist because Angao did not maintain complete records for native personnel. Without the carriers, the Australian defense would have collapsed in August. The Australians could not have maintained forward positions. The wounded could not have been evacuated. The Japanese would have reached Port Moresby unopposed. The contribution of approximately 5,000 Papuan carriers represented the difference between strategic defeat and fighting withdrawal. Australian soldiers called them Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, a term of respect and affection. After the war, formal recognition was delayed until 2009, when the Australian government authorized campaign medals for Papua New Guinean service personnel. By mid-September, the Japanese had advanced to Yoribaiwa Ridge, 16 kilometers from Imata Ridge, which was 32 kilometers from Port Moresby. They could see the coast. Australian artillery at Ower's Corner was within range. Port Moresby seemed inevitable. Then the Japanese stopped. On September 18th, Horii received orders to halt the advance and consolidate positions. The 17th Army had decided to prioritize Guadalcanal over Port Moresby. American Marines had landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th and captured Henderson Field. The Japanese needed to retake the airfield. Resources allocated to the Port Moresby operation were being redirected to the Solomon Islands. Horii protested. He was 16 kilometers from Port Moresby. His troops were exhausted but functional. One more push would capture the city. The response was unambiguous. Withdraw to defensive positions on the north coast. Hold Kokoda. Prepare for possible evacuation. The Japanese withdrawal began on September 24th. They retreated along the same track they had advanced along, fighting rearguard actions at each position the Australians had defended in August. The roles reversed. Now the Australians advanced and the Japanese withdrew. The terrain favored the defender regardless of which side occupied it. The pursuit was cautious. Australian forces had been reinforced by the 25th Brigade, which included the 2nd 25th, 2nd 31st, and 2nd 33rd Battalions. Brigadier Kenneth Ether commanded. His orders were to pursue the Japanese but avoid being drawn into ambushes. The Japanese were retreating, but they were not defeated. They were conducting a planned withdrawal to positions where they could establish a defensive line. The Battle of Templeton Crossing on October 16th demonstrated this. A Japanese rearguard of approximately 300 men held positions overlooking the track. The 2nd, 25th Battalion attacked frontally, while the 2nd, 31st maneuvered to flank. The fighting lasted 6 hours. The Japanese withdrew only after sustaining approximately 70 casualties. Australian losses were 23 killed and 47 wounded. Similar actions occurred at Eora Creek on October 21st, at Isarava on October 28th, and at Alola on October 31st. Each rearguard delayed the Australian advance by 12 to 24 hours. Each inflicted casualties that reduced Australian combat effectiveness. By November 1st, when Australian forces reached the approaches to Kokoda, the pursuit had cost 120 Australian lives and over 300 wounded. Kokoda was retaken on November 2nd without resistance. The Japanese had withdrawn to defensive positions at Oivi and Garari, 8 kilometers north. Brigadier George Vossi of the 7th Division established headquarters in Kokoda village. Engineers began repairing the airfield. By November 3rd, supply aircraft were landing, alleviating the logistics burden that had constrained Australian operations since July. The final battle of the Kokoda Track Campaign occurred at Oivi and Garari between November 5 and November 11th. Approximately 2,800 Japanese troops defended a fortified position blocking the track to the north coast. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions attacked frontally on November 5th. They made no progress. The Japanese positions were too strong. Frontal assault cost 40 Australian casualties for no gain. Vasey decided to outflank the position. The 25th Brigade moved along a secondary track to the east, circling behind the Japanese position. By November 9th, they had completed the encirclement. The Japanese attempted to break out, but were caught in the open. Approximately 800 died in the fighting. Approximately 400 escaped to Buna. The remainder surrendered or died from wounds. Australian casualties at Oivi and Garari totaled 34 killed and 109 wounded, but the Kokoda track was cleared. The Japanese were pushed back to their beachheads at Gona, Buna, and Sanananda on the north coast. The campaign transitioned to siege warfare. Australian and American forces surrounded the beachheads in mid-November and began attacks designed to eliminate the Japanese garrison completely. The fighting around the beachheads lasted until late January 1943. It was more costly than the Kokoda fighting. The Japanese were dug into bunkers constructed from coconut logs and coral. Artillery fire had minimal effect. Flamethrowers were required to clear each position. The 39th Battalion participated in the Gona fighting from December 3rd to December 18th, losing 8 officers and 220 men before being withdrawn. The strategic result was elimination of Japanese forces from Papua. By February 1943, the threat to Port Moresby had ended. Japanese forces remaining in New Guinea concentrated at La and Salamaua, 100 kilometers northwest of Buna. They would defend those positions until September 1943, when Australian forces captured them in operations that cost another 1,000 Australian casualties. The Kokoda Track Campaign cost 625 Australian lives and over 1,600 wounded. Disease casualties exceeded 4,000. Malaria infected approximately 75% of personnel who served on the track. Dysentery was nearly universal. Scrub typhus, dengue fever, and tropical ulcers affected thousands. The campaign demonstrated that disease was more dangerous than combat in jungle warfare. Medical services were overwhelmed. Treatment consisted of quinine for malaria, sulfa drugs for dysentery, and amputation for gangrenous wounds. Japanese casualties were higher, but precise figures do not exist. Estimates suggest over 2,000 killed in combat along the track. Disease and starvation killed perhaps 3,000 more. Japanese supply lines were longer than Australian supply lines. Japanese logistics were less efficient. Japanese forces received minimal air support after September, when American control of the air over the Solomon Islands cut Japanese aerial resupply routes. By November, Japanese troops at the beachheads were starving. Hori died on November 23rd when his raft capsized while crossing the Kumusi River during the retreat. His body was never recovered. The South Seas Detachment ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Survivors were evacuated to Rabaul in January 1943 and reconstituted as occupation troops. They did not participate in offensive operations again. The Kokoda Track Campaign has assumed mythic significance in Australian military history. It is frequently described as the battle that saved Australia from Japanese invasion. This is strategic exaggeration. Japanese planning documents captured after the war show no intention to invade the Australian mainland. Japanese naval and air forces lacked the capacity to support an amphibious invasion across the Coral Sea. The objective was Port Moresby. Not Sydney, but Port Moresby mattered. Loss of Port Moresby would have given Japan airfields capable of striking northern Australia. Australian bases at Darwin, Townsville, and Cairns would have been within range of Japanese bombers. Allied supply lines to New Guinea would have been severed. The strategic position in the Southwest Pacific would have deteriorated significantly. The campaign also demonstrated that militia forces, properly led and supported, could defeat veteran Japanese troops. The 39th Battalion earned respect through performance. They were not elite soldiers. They were 18-year-old conscripts with minimal training. But they held positions against overwhelming odds. They conducted fighting withdrawals that preserved their combat effectiveness. They inflicted casualties that delayed the Japanese advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The military lessons from Kokoda were documented in after-action reports submitted to Allied Land Headquarters in Brisbane. The reports identified several factors critical to jungle warfare success. First, training must emphasize small unit tactics and individual initiative. Jungle fighting occurred at ranges under 10 meters. Platoons and companies operated independently of battalion control. Soldiers needed to make tactical decisions without orders from commanders who could not see them. Second, logistics determined operational capability. Forces could not advance beyond their supply lines. Supply lines in jungle terrain were limited to what men could carry. This imposed strict limits on how far forces could advance and how long they could sustain operations. The side with more efficient logistics had decisive advantage. Third, disease prevention was as important as ammunition supply. Malaria prophylaxis, water purification, and sanitation prevented more casualties than medical treatment after infection occurred. Units that maintained discipline regarding preventive measures sustained lower casualty rates than units that did not. Fourth, native auxiliaries were essential. Papuan carriers, guides, and scouts provided capabilities that Australian forces lacked. Knowledge of terrain, languages, and local conditions could not be replicated by training. Units that integrated effectively with native personnel operated more effectively than units that did not. These lessons were incorporated into training programs for Australian forces preparing for operations in New Guinea and Borneo. Jungle warfare schools were established. Training emphasized physical fitness, small unit tactics, and survival skills. Equipment was modified for tropical conditions. Uniforms changed from khaki drill to jungle green. Weapons were updated from First World War rifles to modern automatic weapons. The 39th Battalion was disbanded in July 1943. The official reason was consolidation of militia units to create more efficient force structure. The actual reason was that militia units like the 39th had demonstrated their worth and were being replaced by regular AIF units now returning from the Middle East. Members of the 39th who had been conscripts were absorbed into the 36th Battalion. Volunteers who wanted to serve overseas transferred to AIF units. The battalion's service was recognized in 1943 when Kokoda was awarded as a battle honor. The 39th is the only unit authorized to carry Kokoda on its colors. In 2006, the Australian Army raised the 39th Personnel Support Battalion, adopting the numerical designation to perpetuate the original battalion's heritage. The connection is ceremonial rather than operational, but it acknowledges that the 39th Battalion's service at Kokoda deserves institutional memory. The track itself is now a pilgrimage route. Approximately 2,000 people walk it annually, most of them Australians seeking to understand what their grandfathers experienced in 1942. The trek takes 7 to 10 days. It requires physical fitness equivalent to climbing 6,000 meters of cumulative elevation gain over 96 kilometers. Commercial operators provide guides, porters, and camping equipment. The Papua New Guinea government maintains the track and requires trekking permits. Veterans who walk the track in the old age report that it seems shorter than they remember. The terrain is unchanged. The mud is as deep, the mountains as steep, but memory magnifies difficulty. The physical challenge seems less significant than the knowledge that soldiers fought here while sick, exhausted, and under fire. Walking the track without those burdens cannot replicate the experience, but it provides context. The villages along the track remember Kokoda, Isurava, Iora Creek, Templeton Crossing, Efog, Brigade Hill, Yoribaiwa. Each village has monuments. Each monument lists the units that fought there. Each village elder can tell stories passed down from grandparents who witnessed the fighting or carried wounded soldiers or buried dead troops from both sides. At Isurava, a memorial honors the Australian soldiers who fought there. 4 pillars rise from a stone base. Each pillar represents a value: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. The memorial was dedicated in 2002 on the 60th anniversary of the battle. It includes the names of all Australians who died along the track. 625 names, average age 23. The memorial does not include Japanese names. This is not intentional exclusion. Japanese records were less complete. Many Japanese casualties were never identified. Bodies were buried in mass graves or left where they fell. After the war, Japanese remains recovery teams found skeletal remains throughout the Owen Stanleys. Some were returned to Japan. Some remain unrecovered. The tactical lessons from Kokoda remain relevant. Terrain matters more than numbers. Small units with high morale can defeat larger forces if they use terrain effectively. Logistics determines strategic possibilities. Disease prevents more casualties than combat. Native support is essential for operations in unfamiliar terrain. These principles apply to every campaign where conventional forces operate in difficult terrain against determined opponents. The human cost cannot be reduced to lessons learned. 625 Australian soldiers died. Over 4,000 were evacuated sick. Thousands of Papuan carriers died without record. An unknown number of Japanese soldiers died far from home in conditions no soldier should experience. The track remembers. The jungle consumed bodies and equipment and evidence of what occurred there. But the names remain. The tactical positions remain. The strategic result remains. Australia was not invaded. Port Moresby was not captured. The Japanese advance was stopped at Yoribaiwa Ridge, 16 kilometers from success. 18 and 19-year-old militia soldiers held the line until veteran AIF units arrived. They should not have succeeded. They were outnumbered, out-equipped, and out-experienced. But they understood what was at stake. They fought accordingly. The Kokoda Track Campaign does not fit comfortably into narratives about Australian military tradition. It was not a heroic victory. It was a brutal fighting retreat by undermanned, undertrained, and undersupplied forces who somehow accomplished their mission. They held positions that should have fallen in hours. They withdrew in good order when they should have broken. They inflicted casualties that delayed the Japanese advance long enough for the strategic situation to change. This was not courage in any conventional sense. This was exhausted teenagers with dysentery holding defensive positions in pouring rain against veteran troops who had never lost. This was soldiers too sick to walk carrying wounded comrades on stretchers. This was native carriers moving supplies forward while being strafed by aircraft. This was commanders making impossible decisions about who would hold and who would withdraw. Knowing both choices meant casualties. The Kokoda Track was 96 kilometers of hell. The campaign lasted 113 days. The conditions were worse than any involved had experienced. The terrain was worse than training had prepared them for. The enemy was more skilled than expected. Disease was more dangerous than combat. Supply was more critical than ammunition. Native support was more essential than artillery. And the militia held. The chocolate soldiers, supposedly untrained and unreliable, fought the Japanese to a standstill. They retreated when necessary. They held when possible. They inflicted casualties that made the Japanese pause. They bought time that allowed reinforcements to arrive. They did their job. The 39th Battalion strength on July 7, 1942, was 1,068. On September 5, 1942, when they were relieved, strength was 185. The arithmetic is simple. The implication is clear. They paid in full for holding the line.